Hello, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to give a special thank you to our gold sponsors. We've got Alumni Learning, Aptus Solution, and Comms Multilingual. They are all taking part in a live discussion this Wednesday at 12 o'clock, discussing the emerging world of work post-COVID-19. So I would encourage you all to join if you are available. If you want to find out more, please do check out our sponsors pages on the ABP website. And it is with great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic is the Chief Talent Scientist at Manpower Group. He's a psychologist, he's an author of 10 books, and very much an entrepreneur. He has written over 150 scientific papers, articles for organizations such as the BBC, The Guardian, Forbes, and Fast Company, to name a few. He absolutely uses science to help organizations to predict human performance and for people to understand themselves better. So now Thomas and I are going to have a conversation about why AI, artificial intelligence, and analytics are key to building a better future for work and for workers. Okay. Thank you, Thomas. Over to you.
Hi, Hardeep. Thank you. Thank you for this kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Obviously, it would have been an even bigger pleasure to be together in analog format. But, you know, the important thing, I think, is that we are still humans and we exist even in the virtual world. And this is still humans talking to humans as opposed to kind of automated or artificial version of ourselves fully replacing us. So here we are today. So I think I'd like to spend some time talking about the area that I consider the most important aspect of talent management today. And probably it isn't something that is going to change anytime in the short-term future. If we think about the origins of talent management, I think they can be dated back to around 22, 23 years ago when McKinsey famously coined the term of the war for talent, where the main premise was that in the near future, organizations would not really outperform their rivals or differentiate and win based on their strategy, their IP, their business plan, the industry they were in, but mostly based on their ability to nurture, harness, and develop their talent. So, you know, in the subsequent 20 plus years that passed, we have heard so many business leaders say that people are their biggest asset, that this has almost become a caricature line of shows like The Office. You know, it's almost like when a manager or leader says, I am a people person, or my people are the biggest asset, we almost certainly can assume that the opposite is true and that that is not the case. So as business psychologists and people interested in making business psychology an indispensable tool for boosting organizational effectiveness, I think a good starting point is to realize that there is still room for improvement and a lot of progress to be made around the war for talent 20 plus years later. And if you think about the war for talent, it is mostly fought and it is most critical and decisive at the top of the pyramid, where talent matters the most, not where individual contributors can be better or worse employees, which in essence affects a tiny portion of their teams, organizations, and the workforce. But when we judge and evaluate the performance of leaders who are responsible for many others and whose decisions and whose mistakes affect not just their teams and organizations, but societies at large. So it's with that kind of context and framework, or that sort of a broad situation, that I'd like to focus a little bit more on the subject of leadership. And the main topic that I want to discuss is the issue of leadership incompetence, which I have been researching and discussing and exploring now for some time, 10, 15 years, and which is also the subject of my last book, which is, I have to say, casually lying around me. So I have to show it, although the Northern Lights might not make it easy for you to see it. Let's see if we can approach. No, look, the Northern Lights are, okay, here we go, here we go. It's coming, it's coming. Yes, it is. There it is. Okay. So why do so many incompetent men become leaders? We're gonna make sure that you can see it later on. I think you should be able to see it now. Yes. Not. Yes, there it is. The tie could be a tie that I am wearing, but it's not, because I'm not an incompetent man. So no tie on my neck. Thank you. I can see you can see it now. So I want to talk a little bit about this book, which was published last year and really took maybe 6 or 7 years in the making. The book is based on an article that I first published on Harvard Business Review in 2013, an article with the same title. And the article became one of Harvard Business Review's most popular articles. It was sort of sadly predictive and apocalyptic in a way. Every year, more and more incompetent men rose to the leadership ranks, and it forced or pushed the article to the top 5 or #1 spot on the Harvard Business Review site. The gap between the article appearing and the book coming out was mostly the result of the publisher not being convinced and being somewhat cautious, if not worried about the possible impact of publishing a book with this title. Why do so many incompetent men become leaders, given that 60 or 70% of its audience are male leaders, male executives? And I sort of begged my publisher to publish a book or turn the article, the Harvard Business Review article, into a book for 6 or 7 years, and the response was always like, we can't do this. 60 or 70% of our readers are men. They're going to be offended or upset. And I kept on saying that wouldn't be the case, because one of the characteristics of incompetence is the inability to realize how incompetent you are. So if you are in the incompetent male category, you probably won't notice. And if you question yourself and think there might be even the slightest hint of probability or possibility or likelihood that you are incompetent, you probably aren't, because you have some self-awareness of some ability to engage in self-criticism. By the way, if our listeners and our audience today is wondering whether they might be themselves incompetent leaders, I posted a little link to a survey, an article that has a survey embedded, and some of the questions they can be asking themselves if they want to evaluate their propensity to be an incompetent leader or not. So with that, a little bit more context on the original piece. When it came out in 2013, the article was an antidote or an attempt to provide an antidote to the lean in movement that Sheryl Sandberg had just kicked off or launched. My assumption was, or my premise, or at least the argument that I tried to make at that time, was that instead of blaming women for not leaning in and essentially behaving like incompetent men, or displaying the level of confidence that the average incompetent man displays, we should actually stop falling for people who lean in when they don't have the talents to back it up. So instead of kind of pointing the finger at women and accusing them or blaming them for misfortunes that are clearly the product of political, nepotistic, and unfair systems, we should try to get better at identifying leadership potential. And that's basically the main point the book makes as well, that really, if you want to make it easier for competent women to get to the top, a good starting point is to make it harder for incompetent men to rise to the top. In the words of my editor of the original article in the book, Sarah Green Carmichael, who is by far the most talented editor that I was lucky or had the privilege to work with, equality is not exceptional women getting ahead, but incompetent men not getting ahead. That's the best path towards equality. And of course, if you think about it more slowly or deeply, the issues of the lean-in, the flaws of the lean-in approach had been highlighted by psychological research for some time. First, we know that even if we succeed at making women behave more like men or display some of the prototypical masculine traits that often account for male success, applying for jobs that you're not qualified for, speaking when you have nothing to say, mansplaining things, interrupting, and faking leadership, all things that men typically excel or do more often than women, it's not going to help them because the standards that are used to judge behavior in women are different than the standards that are used to judge behaviors in men. And if they help and women succeed, you're not going to improve the quality of leaders. You're going to end up with a lot of women in charge who out-male males in masculinity. And as my colleague Oliver Bergman, who has a great column at The Guardian, noted reviewing my book, the solution to a world run by overconfident fools is not to make the other half of the world overconfident too, right? So there's actually quite serious moral implications in underpinning the lean-in argument, even if it was well-intended and even if it was designed to help women in the first place. So, if you succeed at bullshitting your way up, that might be good for you, but bad for everyone else. And again, I think, in a normal world where we are able to judge other people's talents and potential, we wouldn't make it a precondition to other people's career success that they spend a lot of time bragging, self-promoting, managing up, and blowing their own trumpet. You can go as far back in history as Plato and find a quote by him that says something along the lines of, "Only those who don't seek power should be allowed to hold it." And that tells you everything you need to know about lean-in. So expanding on that, the point I make in the book and that I have tried to make in my research throughout these last couple of decades is that there are three pervasive myths that corrupt our understanding of talent in leaders and that distort our ability to predict and identify leadership potential. The first is the idea that confidence is an essential leadership quality. If you look into the actual research on any area of competence and performance, there's a very, very weak, loose correlation between confidence, how good people think they are at something, and competence, how good they actually are at something. The overlap is about 9%, meaning that more often than not, you're going to have to choose between one or the other, confidence or competence. Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I would rather have a pilot, assuming that flying is still, a thing in the near future, a dentist, a heart surgeon, and even a chef who is competent rather than confident. If you have people who think they're good but they're not, that might be okay for them, but not for everyone else. You know, if you looked at the average or mainstream popular literature around talent and leadership development, you know, it's been diluted to the self-help industry. You'd be forgiven to think that the world, or the average person in the world, might be pathologically insecure and have huge issues with self-esteem, and you know that we need to do a lot to boost their egos. In reality, it's exactly the opposite. Most people are not as good as they think, especially if they're leaders, and even more so if they are male leaders. I sometimes, well, I used to joke, but it has become a reality, and to many people it's no longer funny, that if you are in executive coaching or if you work in leadership development, your main role is to lower people's confidence so that it aligns with their actual competence. I think that is true, and it is true not just in the realm of politics, where most leaders are close to the uncoachable parameter, but also in the world of corporations. If you or a coach or a tool or evidence can provide people with a reliable signal to help them understand that they're not as good as they think, and their self-views are not mirrored by what other people think of them or how other people view them, you would probably make them better. And of course, you know, so contrary to popular belief, the world is not pathologically insecure. If anything, the world suffers from a surplus of confidence. You can look up the work of my UCL colleague, Tali Sharot, on the optimism bias, that even provides a lot of evidence for the neurophysiological or neuroscientific research, suggesting that people, you know, if they have a choice, if we have a choice between an accurate interpretation of reality and one that makes us feel good about ourselves, we would go for the latter most of the time. People are really, really good at reality distortion, and self-enhancing bias is the norm, not the exception. Of course, men are even better at reality distortion than women. And if anything, the problem with the world is not that women are not confident enough, and if we can boost women's confidence, they will become more talented or better leaders, but lowering males' confidence, which would probably improve their own leadership potential and, you know, the order of things for everyone else. Again, even if you think about the literature on imposter syndrome, so much writing, so much literature dedicated to helping people cope with imposter syndromes. Imposter syndrome, the idea that you are overly self-critical and you think of yourself too harshly, and you know you're actually better than you think. That applies to a very small minority of people. And in any event, it will be better to live in a world run by people, leaders who have imposter syndrome, than a world run by imposters. So de-emphasizing confidence as a major marker of leadership and focusing less on confidence and more on competence is probably the best opportunity to improve in talent management, because it would improve the quality of our leaders. The second is the charisma myth. I mean, charisma rules not just in politics, but in most of the decisions and selections that we have or see around leaders. Charisma is not bad per se. It's you know, if you are smart, competent, ethical, and charismatic, that's a great thing. If you are empathetic, altruistic, you know your stuff, you're smart, curious, and you're the right man in the right position or the right woman in the right position, I would like you to be as charismatic as possible so you can enhance your influence and bring others along and so on. So charisma is an amplifier. That also means that if you're not competent or not honest, you will use charisma to your own detriment. So in a way, I think that it's important to understand that charisma is mostly about style rather than substance. And if leader selection can mature enough to focus on substance rather than style, charisma will be a nice add-on, but de-emphasizes the selection criterion. It's a sad state of affairs when, all style and no substance get you further in life than no style and all substance. And the third flawed indicator, or the third myth that we need to overcome, is this idea that narcissism is related in some positive way to leadership potential. Now, this may sound like controversial, and I know that you might think, no, hold on, it's about humility and integrity. But the reality is that most of our choices of leadership are compatible, congruent, and in sync with a preference for narcissistic individuals. In fact, most of the advice that is given in popular contexts, readings, publications, outlets on how to become a leader promotes a narcissistic mindset. Don't worry about what people think of you. If you think you're great, you are. Just be yourself. Everyone will love you for displaying your authentic, unfiltered, and uncensored version of yourself. And love yourself no matter what. The only thing that matters is what you think of you, etc. I mean, society as a whole is trending towards narcissism. We know from Jean Twenge and her team of researchers that narcissism has been increasing or on the rise in much of the Western world at a pace incomparable to any other human traits. Maybe obesity has been rising at a similar or comparable trait, but nothing else at a similar comparable pace. So if our definition of a leader is how many followers they have or how successful they are at promoting themselves, or our definition of talent is whether they have talents or whether they're famous even in the absence of talent, and our admiration for people is based not on what they have actually accomplished, but whether they are famous for not having accomplished anything else or famous for the sake of being famous, then we should not be surprised that we have a lot of leaders that are kind of good at self-promotion and have great fantasized or self-perceived talents, but no actual talents. If our definition or the competencies that we look for in a leader resemble the competencies of a stand-up comedian, then we shouldn't be surprised that we end up with a lot of stand-up comedians in charge. So in essence, there are three things that we can do to overcome current challenges or improve the state of affairs. The first is focus on the right traits. One of the biggest, or perhaps the only silver linings of this pandemic has been to highlight the fact to most people who weren't aware of it and people who weren't very interested in leadership, the fact that groups, teams, organizations, and societies are generally better off when their leaders are competent rather than confident, humble rather than charismatic, and honest rather than narcissistic. And in a logical world, we wouldn't have needed a pandemic to realize that we are generally better off with leaders who are smart, rational, empathetic, altruistic, humble, coachable, and honest or ethical. But it is okay if we have learned the lesson this hard way and we actually correct or improve our evaluations and selections of leaders going forward. Now, this will require the ability to distrust, or the maturity and security to distrust our own instincts. I'm not really just talking about voters here. I'm talking about a lot of HR professionals and managers who make intuitive decisions about their leaders. The same managers or leaders who are apocalyptic and critical or paranoid about the rise of AI, artificial intelligence, data, and evidence-based tools for identifying and developing leadership potential, but will tell you that they know talent when they see it. They know if someone has potential or not because they just do, and who then engage in a lot of confirmation bias to avoid acknowledging their mistakes going forward. So we need to focus on the right traits, focus on competence rather than confidence, humility rather than charisma, and integrity rather than narcissism. And we also need to learn to trust the data and use science-based tools to identify whether someone has leadership potential or not. And the last thing we need to do, if we're interested in helping more competent women get to the top, is to focus on talent rather than gender. Now, this is very interesting because, you know, whenever I speak about my book and I share some of our findings from our research programs with an executive audience, the number one comment that I get from people, especially male executives, is, well, you know, I think all this fuss about diversity and inclusion, D&I or DNI, DE&I, DE&IB, if you add belonging, is BS because the best person should get the job. You know, I don't care about their gender. I want the best person for the job. And my answer is always, I agree. Wouldn't that be nice? Sadly, there is no indication that that is happening right now, which is why most people still have far from optimal experiences with their bosses, which is why if you Google my boss is, or my manager is, or my supervisor is, you'll see what the common autocomplete functions are: abusive, toxic, micromanaging me, a crook, and I don't want to mention some of the impolite or less polite options. That's why only 13% of people are engaged. That's why most people, not just prior to the pandemic, but even right now, are having to reimagine their careers. And that's why things like the Peter principle, that everyone rises to their own level of incompetence, and my own principle, which is that incompetent men rise to the point that they make other people miserable and make them quit their jobs, or mantras such as people join companies but leave bosses, are all too common. So that's the one response. That's the first response. To the most common response is like, you know, we should focus on talent. I agree. It would be very nice to make leadership selection meritocratic and focus on talent rather than gender. If you did this, if you could do it in a sort of wine blind tasting way and be blind to gender, you would actually not just end up with more women in charge, but more women than men in charge, because women outperform men when it comes to empathy, EQ, self-awareness, people skills, humility, integrity. So, you know, when people talk about the fact that a small number of leaders today are making a better job managing the pandemic, and they all happen to be female, that's not news to anyone who has been researching or looking at large-scale data on the difference between leadership potential and leadership emergence. There is a big disconnect between the people who make it and the people who should make it. And the second point, and I'll open up for the Q&A immediately afterwards, the second kind of criticism or response that I have gotten as a consequence or because of my book is that, you know, it's not just incompetent women, but incompetent people. It's not just incompetent men that need to be stopped. And, you know, maybe I should have relabeled or picked a different title for my book and not ask why do so many incompetent men become leaders, but why do so many incompetent people become leaders? Because it's not just men, it's people in general. as in, I also know some incompetent women who become leaders. My answer there is that that might be true, but it's not as common. You know, it's not as common. It's a lot harder for a woman to become a leader when she's incompetent than for a man. Incompetent women find it a lot harder to rise to the top than incompetent men do. And that doesn't mean that we should make it easier for incompetent women to get to the top, but we should make it harder for incompetent men. So for sure, from a fairness standpoint, if you just want to end up with similar numbers, you could lower the bar for incompetent women so that more of them rise to the top, but it makes a lot more sense to raise it for men, not just because that will improve the overall quality of leaders, but actually right now there are many men who are disadvantaged because paradoxically they don't display the toxic traits that we value or overvalue in leaders, right? So it's not just that if we understood the value of humility, empathy, EQ, and integrity, more women will get to the top, but also more men with these traits who are not arrogant and have a lot of people skills would be able to get to the top as well. So that was my rambling in kind of a absolute consistency, and to prove the point that I make in the book. If you are a middle-aged white male, as I am, you can get away with mansplaining things for 40 minutes, as I just did. So this was my attempt to do that. And probably my favorite comment that I get from actually a lot of my friends and colleagues, the reaction to the book is, you only realize that they're only listening to you because you are an incompetent man and a white middle-aged man. And I say, that is true. And if that is true, that creates a paradox, because my message and my argument is simultaneously true and false, right? If they're only listening to me because I am an incompetent man, then I'm both right and wrong. Thank you. Opening up for questions.
Thank you, Thomas. That was really insightful. Really appreciated that. So already we have some questions coming through. So I'm going to ask the question, and I really look forward to hearing your responses. So how do you change or get leaders to understand or avoid bias in traditional firms or companies where a push for women to be tokens in leadership are the norm, over rewarding actual merit, especially in male-dominated industries?
Wow, what a question to start.
Absolutely.
It's I mean, the honest answer would be I don't know, because I don't think there is a silver bullet or a one-size-fits-all formula that would help us do that. Now, I do think that in general, you have to pick your battles. Some people are beyond convincing, and excuse me, they won't believe in any arguments or data. I think there are people who can be convinced and have the potential to be convinced. In general, leaders react better to the notion that there is a business case for gender diversity, and that even though it's hard to stomach or accept the fact that what you have in place might not be a meritocracy, it's still better to show them that there is a business case and there is an ROI, and that actually you can simultaneously improve male and female selection of leaders if you focus on the right traits and do it right. Now, all this is very utopian, and sometimes there is no convincing to be made. And if you hadn't fined people for not wearing a seatbelt, they probably never would have, even though seatbelts save life. So I am not a big fan of quotas, but I do think that they are the second best choice. And what I liked about this first question is that it talks about, there is the tokenism side of things, but there is also the role model side of things. You need for women to rise to the top and good leaders to be in charge, so that the criteria shift and change. Now we're seeing this, and we're not just seeing it in the world of politics and when you look at head of states, but I think there is also balance or a shift in leaders who received attention in the corporate sector, with traits like humility, curiosity, and integrity being celebrated more than, you know, Wolf of Wall Street's style of traits.
Yeah, spot on. Thank you. So this one's come up a couple of times now. Competence and confidence. Yeah. So a couple of people have said is that confidence is quite a broad construct. So is there any particular part within confidence that you think is actually the key strength here?
So it's more than a part. I think it's the level, the degree. And okay, to be absolutely clear, you know, I'm not advocating or I'm not arguing that the world would be better off if those who are in charge or people in general are pathologically insecure and inhibited, and they don't want to try anything else, and you know, they're so anxious that they sit home, which, you know, it's something that has known clinical consequences and can be treated as well. But I'm also saying that we have too many people who are at the opposite extreme of the spectrum in positions of responsibility. So the best level of confidence is that which aligns with your actual competence.
Okay.
Whether you're trying to cross a busy road or fly a plane or, you know, perform heart surgery, the best level of confidence is one that tells you accurately whether you can do something or not. And actually, I would even go as far as to say that if it's a little bit lower than your competence, it's good. It's going to make you uncomfortable. You're going to try to close the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And it might make you a little bit cautious of risks and all of that. So in general, the key is to select more people with accurate levels of self-belief rather than very high levels of self-belief. In general, that is also where most coaching interventions start, trying to help people understand how they're being seen. Self-views or self-awareness are really about other awareness. Do you understand how other people think of you? So it's not about, you know, going to an ashram in India and spending 6 months meditating like the Beatles did and finding yourself, but actually paying attention to what other people think of you. And if you do that, then you can calibrate and get better. I mean, we all know it if we think about how we mastered any skills: singing, playing the piano, cooking, learning a language. You need to know what you don't know in order to get better. And so also, in an ideal world, we would actually be good at assessing actual competence and talents. The reason why shows like The X Factor or Britain's Got Talent or you know, all these reality TV shows that are talent-based are so popular is because we can quickly distinguish between how good people are and how good they think they are. And in the early rounds, you have people who stand up and sing as if they were Pavarotti, but they are awful. And that makes us laugh at them and have a good time. We don't do it with our leaders because we're not as good as identifying what their actual talent is. Yeah. So that's the key. And that's where business psychology can help and will help.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So just talking about leaders, you spoke about the three myths of leadership you mentioned. You talked about the character of the leaders. So how do we change that type within people so that they value humility and competence far greater than they do today? How do we make that shift?
Yeah, so you know, one of the biggest opportunities to improve and to enable this shift is to get serious about collecting and inspecting actual performance data within organizations. You know, right now, the main problem that leadership selection and development has as a field is that it's too easy to avoid measuring how leaders are performing. You know, so it's almost like there's a metaphysical element to this whereby you pick someone as a leader, and then 6 months later or a year later, you want to ask yourself, or other people are asking you, was this the right choice or not? Or you develop someone as a leader and you want to ask after a year or two, is it working? And it's too wishy-washy, it's too ambivalent, you know. By the way, this happens in politics as well. In any country, you can ask people who were the most effective heads of states or political leaders in the last 50 or 100 years, and it's very unlikely that you get a data-driven answer. What you're going to get is, I like this person, or this like this one, or I think this one should have won or not. So it's like discussions about football teams, or what's your favorite wine or ice cream. So sanitizing or sterilizing the performance space or the performance realm, so that you actually quantify and have a relatively objective system or framework for rank ordering people in terms of what they add to the organization, is the number one thing to do. And by the way, a lot of people are doing this. I'm sure we have people, or some of our listeners here, who are doing it within their organizations. If you correlate individual leader behavior, traits, competency scores, and 360s to their engagement, team engagement scores, team performance scores, there are now independent quantitative peer reviews of studies, including things that we have done with my own team, that correlate leader behaviors to company performance, stock valuation, market cap, profits, revenues, you know. At least connecting input with output in a better way would help. The second one is to have the humility to distrust our instincts and actually look for data, you know, to be in a position where we de-emphasize everything that is human inference about talent and potential. And this is unnatural, because for 99% of our evolutionary history, we knew leadership when we saw it. We lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers where everyone knew each other very, very well. We selected our own leaders, and we also knew when we made mistakes. Like if you were in a group of 8 or 10 people, hunter-gatherers going around the savannah, and you made a mistake because you chose the wrong leader, you would be eaten and disappear. You know, so today, if you choose the wrong president, the wrong prime minister, or the wrong CEO, well, you know, they might still have a successful career afterwards, and the company, you know, might decrease its profits, and some people might be let go. And, you know, I mean, now that we have a pandemic, it's clear that leadership can be about life and death. But for the, you know, and that was the case for the longest part of our history, but for the last 100 years, in the last 20 years, that wasn't the case. You know, it's like you can choose between being mega successful or okay. And so to do this, we almost have to get to a stage where leader selection is not just gender blind, but sort of alien to any intuitive remarks that we want to make or inferences we want to draw. And that's very controversial, because people, everything, when you tell people that you can eliminate interviews and just use algorithms and AI, they freak out, as if AI was needed in the world to introduce bias, and as if humans hadn't done a wonderful job in recent history to bring and, you know, thrive on biases in the workplace. So it's one of the wonderful paradoxes or ironies of this field and in this kind of area, small area of talent management, that increasingly everything where you want to attend to is stuff that you shouldn't attend to. Like I'm talking to you right now, and I can see, you know, your gender, I can infer things about your social class, your nationality, your age, maybe even your personality. All that stuff that I love to attend to is stuff that I shouldn't attend to, because my inferences are mostly going to be wrong, and I'm going to project my own preferences. And contrary to popular belief, algorithms, AI, artificial intelligence, they cannot be biased in a human sense. They don't have, you know, a fragile self-esteem they need to protect by bringing other people down, and they don't have an agenda. They're not moral or amoral, ethical or unethical. They're just finding correlations or patterns between signals and outcomes. So, you know, it's hard to acknowledge this, but a world in which humans are totally removed from leader identification and selection process would be as much fairer and more accurate and more efficient and better as a world in which all human drivers are taken off the road and we only have driverless cars or autonomous vehicles.
Okay. So on that note, what are the key things that we as occupational psychologists, business psychologists can do within our world of work to make that change, to make that shift?
First of all, continue to be evidence-based and data-driven, and understand that science is not perfect, but it's the best way to identify your mistakes and improve on them. And it's not about getting it perfectly right, but finding better ways of being wrong and incremental improvements and being more data-driven. If you want to make organizations more meritocratic and talent-centric and reduce nepotism and toxic politics and corruption, is the best vehicle and tool for doing it. So occupational psychologists and business psychologists need to be a vessel for that science and bring it to the workplace. It's also true that being really knowledgeable or good at that science doesn't get you anywhere. You have to understand the business and understand strategy and understand the industry and understand that your stakeholders don't care about the fluffy stuff, psychology, and don't care about soft skills or empathy or that. They might say they do, but they care about results. So you have to make the link with results. And the third one is that you need to develop your own soft skills and influence and negotiation skills and persuasion skills and have EQ. Being the smartest person in the room is not enough. You need to be able to win hearts and minds. And your audience is capable of rationality, but also, as Dana really says, predictably irrational. They have their own political agenda and their own interests. So, the opportunity is huge because so many more people today talk about data, evidence-based science, and start to understand there is a science to managing and identifying people potential and decoding people, which is progress than at any other point in history. But we're not quite there yet. So you need to structure problems and situations and decisions in a way that you can learn from them and understand where you were wrong, that you were wrong, and correct.
Okay. And artificial intelligence, should we as occupational psychologists be threatened by that?
No, you shouldn't be more threatened by it than you are by correlations or regressions, because in HR, mostly AI is machine learning or at most deep learning or natural language processing. It's a tool for identifying patterns in the data, and more companies and people and organizations have data. The only threat is people, what people want to do with those data. And I always get quite frustrated and annoyed when people immediately say, well, AI is going to be biased because it's programmed by, people. And that is mostly a false premise. AI isn't biased because there is a bunch of teenage and spotty, geeky bros in Silicon Valley wearing a hoodie, mischievously programming algorithms so that they suppress equality and diversity and perpetuate white power. No. AI is biased because the training data, the training sets we have to teach the algorithms what works and what doesn't work contains a lot of human bias. We don't need for artificial intelligence to introduce bias to the workplace. Humans have been doing a wonderful job at that for centuries or millennia. So we should worry about humans who have the wrong or unethical intentions and might leverage or use AI for unmeritocratic, unfair, or unjust purposes. But we should also appreciate that artificial intelligence is a wonderful tool or technique or methodology to discover bias in the first place. When Microsoft and Amazon failed to deploy a chatbot, because when they train a chatbot to predict who gets promoted in a company, they mostly recommend that middle-aged white male engineers get the job is not the algorithms that are biased. It's the company culture that is promoting those individuals. Let me be absolutely clear on this. If you don't use AI, chatbots, or the algorithms, those people are still promoted, you know? So you could look at that and say, oh my God, we should never use AI, or understand that AI is the critical tool and data point that you need to get better. Much like if you're trying to lose weight, you know, it helps to have a scale that works and that tells you how much you weigh, as opposed to smashing it when what you see is not what you like. Exercise more, eat less, and use a good scale.
Thank you. Thank you for those tips. So we've got one last question. Is there any learning from Scandinavian experiences where quotas have taken place?
I think the learnings are, to be fair, you know, the learnings are mixed. You know, I think in some instances, there's always the inability to extrapolate to other cultures, because Scandinavia is a sort of very niche culture and society, if you want to generalize, because there's also differences between the Scandinavian countries. So when things work, it doesn't mean they're going to work in Britain, the US, Singapore, Brazil, or Sumatra. And when they don't work, it also doesn't mean that we are at the same point of maturity or immaturity elsewhere. Secondly, I would say that, you know, in Norway, for example, the lesson has been that if you use quotas, it has worked very well in the public sector, but not in the private sector. And often, you know, what they find is what I would predict and what I talk about in the book a lot, which is that if you focus a lot on gender, even if you're hiring good female leaders, it might backfire because people might assume that this is positive discrimination, and you know, it might kind of perpetuate the flawed assumption that if you selected on talent, more men would be there, you know. And that, I think, is like the important third point, and the main point that I would make is that really, if you do these things purely based on gender or age or race or class or any demographic category, it might backfire, or at least not really work. Because why should you be blind to talent when we have all these tools, all these theories, and the willingness to actually also take into account whether someone has a higher or lower probability of being an effective leader, you know? So then it is also true, you know, again, if you hadn't forced people to wear seatbelts, probably more people would have died. And sometimes you have to force humans to do what's good for them. And sometimes that's the only way to create a change in role models, in side guys. And let me be absolutely clear on this. The glass can be half full or half empty. I mean, half full means if we had fallen asleep in the 1950s and 60s and woke up today, clearly we would see the world as much more diverse, more progressive, and more meritocratic than it was in the 1950s, 1960s, which is why when we watch Mad Men, we kind of laugh at the ridiculousness of the chauvinism and racism and everything else. At the same time, that means that if we fell asleep today and we woke up in 50 or 60 years' time, we would look back at today's world, 2020, and see things like Lean In as benevolent sexism and really, really outrageous, non-progressive, backwards kind of methodology. So, you know, the glass is half full or half empty, depending what your parameters are.
Okay. Thank you so much. We did have a fair few